Therapy Chat Podcast, episode 276.
This is the Therapy Chat Podcast with Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute for seeking help from a licensed mental health professional. And now, here's your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C.
Therapists, do you feel stuck when working with clients who are numb and disconnected, who have trouble accessing emotion and exploring their inner experience? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. Sensory motor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body in therapy as both a source of information and a target for intervention, because words are not enough. Go beyond theories and gain practical ways to open a new dimension for effective therapy. Visit Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute online at sensorymotor.org today. Hi, welcome back to Therapy Chat. I'm your host, Laura Reagan, and today I'm so thrilled to have a returning guest for his third interview. Today, my guest is Tim Desmond. Tim is the author of Self-Compassion and Psychotherapy and the Self-Compassion Skills Workbook, as well as his newest book, How to Stay Human in, I'll censor, an effed up world. And he's a co-founder of the Morning Sun Meditation Center, a co-organizer of Occupy Wall Street, which I just found out about today. I think that's so cool. And a student of Thich, Nhat, Hanh, distinguished faculty at Antioch University. Like I said, he's been on the podcast twice before, and his newest project is peercollective.com, which is a platform for emotional support that I'm just so interested to hear about. So, Tim, thank you so much for coming back to Therapy Chat today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure, and I can't wait to let our audience sort of hear what all you've been doing since the last time I had you on, and how you're really spreading your message of compassion just, far and wide. So before we even dive into it, though, will you just start off by telling our audience a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Yeah. So I think maybe the easiest way to sort of start is how I ended up getting into professional psychology. I spent most of my time after undergrad going back and forth between grassroots kind of political organizing and spending time with Thich Nhat Hanh at different Buddhist monasteries and learning meditation. And those are sort of like the two things that have been really huge driving force in my life. And I went into professional psychology as sort of a way to extend my interest in meditation and in Buddhist psychology. And then in my professional life, I ended up kind of focusing on mindfulness and self-compassion practices within psychotherapy, as well as just like psychotherapy outcome research, and just really understanding, which for me are so deeply connected, what is it that drives outcomes? Like my background in Buddhist psychology, the core question is sort of like, how do we recognize and transform suffering? And learning years of meditation and sort of Buddhist psychology, and sort of this understanding that compassionate presence is really the energy that transforms suffering. And then that's kind of driven a lot of my interests in terms of like outcome research, as well as like teaching people kind of meditation practices.
Awesome. Yeah. And that all makes sense. I don't know if I interrupted you, if you wanted to say more.
No. That's kind of like really where I've been at now. And that's like, that leads me to, so like, since the last time we spoke, I think I wrote How to Stay Human this kind of interesting story there is I was pitching a book that was called Mindfulness for People Who Don't Meditate. And it was sort of like a little bit more of a niche kind of book. And my editor at HarperOne basically said like, well, what if you wanted to write a book just kind of for everyone, just like a very general psychology book, what would it be? And I was just like, yeah, how to stay human in a world was sort of like what came up for me. And the idea is we all go through pain in so many different ways. And, what have I learned in my life as a therapist and as a meditation teacher about what helps us to stay in touch with compassion and empathy and just like our real sense of humanity and feeling alive and feeling connection. Like, how do we stay in touch with what's really alive for us going through all of this pain? And so in the book, I talk about a lot of challenges that I've been through in my life. I talk about work as an organizer. I talk about my sort of growing up. I grew up in Boston with a single alcoholic mom, and we were homeless for a while and sort of struggles there. And then as I was writing it, my wife had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and she passed away just not long, or actually just a little while before the book came out. And so a big part of writing it and a big part of the book was sort of like learning how to practice kind of in the midst of crisis. And then, this couple of years later, and now we're sort of all in this shared crisis together.
Very true. And I'm so sorry for the loss of your wife.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that point about like being able to withstand suffering, I guess, during, really hard times is just so powerful, because people always talk about meditation as, you're up on a mountain and, you're away from everything. It's so peaceful and you're silent for days and weeks. And that can be one way. But, in this real life, day to day, full of struggle, competition, violence, it could seem a lot more difficult. So I think the idea is very valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was first starting, so a little bit more just like stuff that's happened since we last spoke. So I was invited to give an author talk at Google on the Mountain View campus. And when I was there, they actually recruited me to run a team working on, there were some people who wanted to do a mental health project. So I ended up working at Google for about 9 months, working on this, basically doing research about online peer counseling. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of like why that was my interest and why I went there. Was sort of given the opportunity to try to start a new thing in mental health. Part of it, so when I was like thinking about coming to Google, I was talking with a lot of people in the field whose opinion I really respect. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, Bruce Wampold, he wrote The Great Psychotherapy Debate. He's like he's from the University of Wisconsin, and basically he's like a big researcher in the world of common factors. Basically the idea that like a very small part of what makes therapy effective are the specific interventions that differ from one type of therapy to the other. And he's one of the people who really kind of mathematically showed how it's the common factors like empathy and warmth and the relationship that drive most of the outcome. So I was talking with Bruce about trying to understand, like, how do we make those kinds of relationships, relationships characterized by empathy and warmth, how do we make them more available? And one of the things that he brought up that I thought was kind of fascinating, and this is interesting, this like relates to your point about meditation. He was saying, we were talking about how emotional intelligence is contextual. Like in the sense that one person could be at a cocktail party and exhibit a lot of emotional intelligence for that place. Like they're charming and they're like making jokes and they just have a lot of emotional intelligence within that context. But then you try to talk with that person about your divorce and they have no idea how to respond. And the opposite can be true. Someone can be like really uncomfortable at a cocktail party, but really great at being present for you when you're going through a hard time. And one of the things that Bruce was talking about is a lot of the research in looking at the impact of our social networks, like in our lives. Like, I don't mean like online social networks. I mean like our actual like social systems. One of the things that he was saying is having a lot of friends and family and a big social circle, it's very protective against, depression and anxiety and that kind of stuff. But once someone's experiencing depression or anxiety, it's not that helpful for recovering. And his hypothesis was that most people have the type of emotional intelligence or skill set to relate positively to someone who's in a good mood. Like most people find that relatively easy, like keeping someone happy who is already happy. And very few people have the skill set to relate positively to someone in a lot of distress. That's sort of an uncommon skill set. And so that's why he was saying, like, some people do have friends and family that they can go to when they're in distress who are really helpful. But broadly speaking, it's a rare trait. And it's one of the reasons that the sort of research shows up that way. And I felt like, I'm just curious, like, what your thought, if that makes sense to you, or I'm just curious, like, to hear your thought about that.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense to me, because I think that when you were talking about that, I was thinking our culture is so averse to any unpleasant feelings, and we don't, we avoid them. It's just such a, positive vibes only type of culture. And, we really want to turn away from when we see, let's say, for example, a person on the street who's homeless. We'd rather turn away than think what it might be like to live on the street. Or, when someone says, I've experienced trauma, I see this so often. People will say that their friends will be just like, they just don't want to talk about it. And, they need someone who can hold that for them.
And for me, that it comes back to how does someone practice mindfulness or meditation? And one of the things, so Bruce and I actually developed this video assessment tool. And basically how it works is you watch 7 short videos that are like simulations of really challenging moments that you might face in trying to offer somebody support. But one of them is sort of like, I'm really Christian and I just need to know, are you a Christian? And then another one is like, yeah, I use Coke at work. My wife doesn't know, but it's not a problem. And so you watch these sort of simulated encounters and then you respond, right? And so at each of these 7 little videos, you respond like, what would you say to this person? And then we developed a tool to sort of grade the responses based on everything that we know that correlates with being effective in providing mental health care. And so that a big part of what we did at Google was sort of like studying and refining this tool to help us to be able to predict, for non-professionals, completely untrained people, could we predict who would be good, who would be effective at sort of providing emotional support? And so one of the things that I found that was really interesting is when I started, so we were testing this on Google employees, we were testing this on various people that we just kind of put an ad on Craigslist. And then I started testing it on a bunch of Buddhists that I knew. And the thing that I found fascinating was about half of the Buddhists were exceptional, like top 2% of all the people that we studied. And then the other half of the Buddhists were awful. And when I talked to them a little bit more, it came down to, what do you do when you're meditating? And the people, when they're meditating, who are paying attention to their own suffering and their own distress, and at least part of, not all, but part of their meditation is like welcoming and embracing, tension or fear or those sorts of things. Those were the people that were excellent at this. And the people whose whole meditation practice was just all about trying to stay positive, when they were confronted with someone who was like in a lot of distress, they were just like a deer in the headlights. They had no idea what to do.
That's such a beautiful point you're making here, because this is that, when you are meditating, are you dissociating or are you actually present to the pain?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, so that's been a big thing for me. And so we did this research at Google for a while, and Bruce Wampold and a few other kind of academic psychologists got involved. And then it became pretty clear that this should not be a Google product. It should be like its own thing. Mm-hmm. So for various reasons, various things kind of came together and we decided, we should. So I left Google and then started something called Peer Collective. And the idea of Peer Collective is that we're just like peer counselors on our platform. Some of them are like, certified peer support specialists. Some of them have graduate degrees in psychology, but a lot of them don't have any background in mental health. In order to get on our program, you need to be able to kind of go through this video assessment and score in the top 3% in terms of your capacity for empathy and warmth and alliance when someone's in distress. And what we're finding is that those people are like from the whole spectrum of society. And so the idea for Peer Collective, and this is the thing that one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you, is so many people need more emotional support right now. And as mental health professionals, it's like there's just not enough of us. And we can't be as available as a lot of the people that we're seeing really need. And so the one of the big things that I'm thinking about in terms of as we grow Peer Collective is just trying to be a service to mental health professionals to supplement what they're doing. And so I'm just like, I guess I'm curious for you, like, when you look at the field and when you look at kind of what's happening in the world, what do you see as like what's really needed? I'm just curious, like what comes up for you?
Yeah, for me, there's clearly I can just say for one thing, as a therapist, there's a huge number of people seeking therapy right now, and almost all of the therapists I know are full. Not to say that another crop won't be graduating from grad school soon, which is wonderful because we need more people. I feel like with COVID, the pandemic, there's a much higher need now and will be in the future because of COVID and because of this experience. On top of what people were already dealing with, I think it's overwhelmed a lot of people's capacity to cope. And then the other part is accessibility to emotional support that is, available, not just like therapists who don't have openings, but availability and affordability and, really being feasible for people to be able to get into. So, one thing I'm thinking about what you're doing is that it seems like a way to destigmatize seeking help. Yeah. For people who are less comfortable with the idea of talking to a therapist and they're like, well, it's not that serious, but I just need some support.
Exactly. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is that there's a huge gap right now between like a crisis line and then seeing sort of a full price, licensed professional. And there's like nothing in between. Mm-hmm. And we know that, and so what Peer Collective is trying to be is that in-between space. And we've seen kind of two main, so we launched about 6 months ago. And in those 6 months, we've had about almost 2,000 people, as we're recording this, have used the platform. And
that's great.
Yeah, thanks. And in that time, we're seeing the two categories of people that keep coming back and coming back. And one is someone who needs support and has limited access. So either they can't afford the $200 an hour therapist, they've contacted their insurance, maybe they don't have insurance, or if they do, their insurance has a 6-month waiting list and they really need to talk to somebody now. So what they're really interested in is the accessibility and the affordability, because we're roughly, we pay our peer counselors $20 an hour, and it's sort of like they work kind of whenever they want to. They set their own schedules. So right now, a half-hour session at Peer Collective costs $14, and an hour-long session costs $28. And so that's affordable for a lot of people. And everybody who comes on the platform gets a free session just to try it out. So there's some people that need help and have limited access. And then the other thing, like what you were saying, some people actually could afford a therapist, but they're looking for a non-clinical relationship. And it's interesting because I know a lot of therapists who are pretty non-clinical in the way that they relate to their clients, but still it can feel formal for people. I mean, I certainly know a lot of therapists who do act very clinical and they keep that sort of clinical distance, and others that don't. But I think the whole idea of like, this isn't therapy, it's peer support. And it's just sort of like the idea is that like, it's a helping relationship based on shared experience. And and so there's definitely that thing of like it being non-clinical that makes some people be able to approach it a little easier. Yeah, I think that I guess like one question for me as you're sort of talking about that and this awareness of people who have a full practice, like how I guess I'd be curious. I'm just curious for you, or you either speaking for yourself or just like you could say like hypothetically for any therapist. But I'm curious like about using something supplementally like this. Like what would you be thinking about in terms of what would you need to know about, or how would you feel about, or how could you imagine either like, so it's like people who are coming to see you and you don't have a space for them, or people that you are seeing, but maybe need more support. Like how would it, I'm just curious, like what you think about utilizing something like this, or what you'd want Peer Collective to be able to provide or whatever to make that easier.
I think one of the questions that would be in my mind is, for myself and to explain to someone I would refer to using this as a complement to therapy or supplement, would be, how will it be different from therapy?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think the legal definition, when we look at sort of like what makes psychotherapy different than other helping relationships, is that there is some element usually of diagnosing and treating, like the idea of like that you're giving somebody a diagnosis and then creating sort of a treatment plan. I know that, again, not all professional therapists work that way, and not all professional therapists even believe in diagnosis. They sort of like, but most do. And so I think that is the clearest like night and day thing, that in peer counseling, you're not going to be diagnosed. And there's not sort of that type of treatment plan. I think the idea and what you'll get with Peer Collective is someone with a lot less training, but someone that is a warm and kind of empathetic person that you can be able to talk with kind of as much as you'd like.
Yeah. So
how does that sit? Like, how does that sit for you in terms of like, is that like clear about how it would be different, or?
Yeah, it is. And I think something that's definitely been in the back of my mind while you've been talking is there are some online platforms right now that are calling themselves, online therapy whenever you want it, 24/7. And, a lot of therapists are balking at those services being presenting what they provide as therapy. So I feel like, because yes, the person you're talking to may be a licensed mental health professional, but how can you be doing, quote, therapy, like by exchanging texts back and forth and without the structure of the therapeutic relationship? I mean, maybe it's just a different way, but I feel like your service seems like a more aligned, it's really doing what it says it's doing, instead of sort of presenting something and packaging it as calling it therapy when it really sort of, I don't know if it really is. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm not sure it really is.
Well, so actually the idea of Peer Collective kind of came back to me a long time ago, like several years ago. I remember working in my private practice and feeling like there were, I don't know, at one point I went through and I was like, so about a third of the people that I'm seeing, I feel like I'm really able to use my expertise. Like I feel like they really need someone with my level of training. But more than half, they just wanted to be able to talk about their week and for someone to care, or just talk about their life and just have that type of witness and care. And I remember just feeling like, God, I would be able to help so many more people if I could like send those people basically to be like, well, when you're ready to do a deep session and you want to like really kind of untangle something that's like kind of, that's hairy for you, come back and let's do a session. And in the meantime, if there was just somewhere that I could go where there would just be like people who care and could listen. And I was like, I feel like I could really help a lot more people that way. And so that's sort of like a stepped care model of like, a lot of the time people just need empathy, but sometimes they need something that's like requires more expertise. That's like one of the things that sort of led me to start thinking along these lines. But when you're saying like the Talkspace, BetterHelp, like a lot of those sorts of companies and the exchanging texts, I can just say for me, I do not think that I could be nearly as helpful to people that I've worked with if we were just emailing back and forth, which is kind of basically what these things do. And at least sort of like philosophically for me, if you believe that a big part of what's transformational is human connection and that experience of like compassion and empathy, I think you can get a little of it through exchanging texts or emails, but it just doesn't quite sit right for me.
Yeah, there's something about the face-to-face, voice-to-voice connection. And I know that the services you mentioned do offer actual therapy sessions virtually as well. But,
Sure.
For the text and email aspect, I agree. It's not nearly as relational. And you can read someone's words and you can know that they're kind words, but I feel the relational, the spark of being relational is the actual feeling of the person.
Yeah.
And that's hard to do in words in that way.
Yeah. And
written
just
words.
Yeah. And just sort of like feeling that someone really cares for you.
Yeah. But I think it's also really interesting that we as therapists are certainly not vetted to that level of how much EQ do we have. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of what you're offering, that not every therapist may have the level of emotional intelligence that you're saying, you're asking of your peer counselors. And I think that's a real benefit to what you're doing, that you're really carefully selecting people who have those qualities and then training them in how to help.
So after we established Peer Collective, Bruce Wampold had finally convinced the University of Wisconsin to use sort of a similar model for vetting doctoral candidates.
Oh, nice.
They're the first, program in the country that's doing that, but they're starting to do like a similar model of like, there are some personal qualities. So I really believe that people can develop empathy and compassion, but I believe it takes a tremendous amount of time and energy and effort to be able to really improve those qualities in yourself. I think it can be done, but I think it's slow and hard. And so for us, it's sort of like, well, ideally, you just start with people that already have those qualities, and then you teach them the parts that are like more easily teachable.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah. So we're really excited about this, and we're trying to figure out ways of partnering with therapists to sort of be an extension, because what you just described is totally the way that I see it. And sort of like so many therapists are full. I mean, sadly, there, like, especially people in private practice, there can almost be this fear of not having a wait list because you don't want to just in terms of your economic livelihood, you don't want to like lose people. But then at the same time, like really from a social standpoint of really trying to improve the mental health of our society, it's like, how do we really get, if we believe that this sort of relationship of, empathy and care has healing powers, can be helpful, then we just want to get that to as many people as possible. So we're just trying to figure out how can we create the service in such a way that it feels like it's supportive for therapists to utilize with people that they can't see or even people that they are seeing.
Yeah, I think it sounds like it can be a great either replacement for therapy for people who don't really have that level of need, or a complement for people who need more than their regular weekly or every other week session with their therapist. And so I think another question that I would have as a therapist is like, how does your model handle if someone is having like a severe mental health concern that's really sort of out of the scope? Let's say they've already been using the service, but then on a certain day, they're extremely in crisis or, suicidal or anything like that. How would your model handle that?
So luckily we're in touch with, we've worked with people from Crisis Text Line and a couple of other crisis lines. And we based our, crisis and escalation training just on, like, if you were to use crisis text line, most likely the person that you that responds to you, and actually, in a lot of crisis lines, that they're not professionals. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of based our training on what they're doing, because we felt like, yeah, well, we're not advertising ourselves as like, we're here if you're in crisis, but we will get people in crisis. So we want to have that level of training there. So that's like that's one of the core pieces that our peer counselors go through. So it's basically, we respond just like very similar to a crisis line. And we really, we do the same sort of assessments and safety plans. And we have licensed providers who are available to get on the call whenever a peer counselor sort of feels out of their depth. And we use, resources like 211 and other ways of like plugging people into the professional system. We like to say that we do resources, not referrals. And so the idea is, when someone comes onto Peer Collective, we're never going to kick them off of Peer Collective, because Peer Collective the whole point is to be there if you can't get anything else.
Yeah.
But we offer resources. So we say like, hey, if you want to see a psychiatrist, we can try to help you find a psychiatrist in your area. If you want to see a therapist, we can help you find a therapist in your area, or a community mental health center. Like if you need help signing up for Medicaid or whatever it is, it just help like navigating your insurance plan, or just someone to talk to, like while you're on your insurance plan's waiting list. Like we just try to have that type of collaborative spirit. So I think like the first question that somebody has if they're in crisis is like, do you have a doctor or a mental health professional who's overseeing your care, and like trying to like make sure that that person is plugged in, has notified that person who's the one who really should know. And if they don't, then trying to help them get one.
Okay. Well, that's really great too. I mean, and the help signing up for Medicaid and things like that, that kind of stuff is very, very, very much needed. Very much needed. Yeah.
So because we provide a free intro session to anyone who finds us, we do a lot. Like we've done a lot of just like helping people to try to find other free services, because we can't. We're not a totally free service, and we're not Medicaid reimbursable yet. We hope to be. We're actually doing a randomized controlled trial right now through UT Austin. And hopefully when we get our evidence back, we might be able to be reimbursable in different ways. But for now, we can only do one free session. So there's a substantial amount of time that we do of trying to help people find more free services.
Well, that's I think the whole thing is amazing. I think that's a really wonderful thing. I mean, for access.
Thanks. Yeah. So that's kind of like what I've really been up to is that sort of like, and I think like for me, what it comes down to is like, I was really trying to teach people how to develop self-compassion and to grow that in themselves. And then sort of got to this point of like, that's hard for a lot of people. It would be great if there was just like an app that you could go to and there were just a lot of compassionate people that you could choose from and could listen to you when you don't have compassion for yourself.
Yeah, that's another piece of it that I think is very special that you mentioned to me before we started recording, being able to choose who you're going to talk to. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to peercollective.com, you'll answer a couple questions about yourself and then a couple questions about the type of person that you believe would be likely to help you. So do you have a gender preference, any sort of like age or identities preference? And then you get to read profiles and kind of look for who seems like they might be the type of person that you think would get you. And then you can book either a 30-minute or a 60-minute session, and it can either be over the phone or over video chat.
That's awesome.
And we've been surprised. It's like almost 2/3 of people choose phone. I don't know if it's like Zoom fatigue or if it's just sort of like the pressure of not wanting to be on camera, but yeah, I thought everyone was going to want video, and I've been surprised that a lot of people just want the sort of, we call it a call my mobile option. They just receive a call.
Well, you know what? So it sounds like you're saying that the person can select call my mobile and then they receive the call instead of having to make the call. And I think that if that's what you're saying, I think that's genius, because it's so hard for people they want the help and they want the connection, but actually making the call can feel so hard.
Yeah. And we get a lot of people, especially in the first, in the sort of free intro session, we get probably at least like 25% of people who don't pick up and just kind of like, so we're trying to figure out how to do that and how to make it a warmer, even just sort of like leading up to a type of experience. We've experimented a little bit with like before the session, sending a text and being like, hey, this is your peer counselor. I'm going to be calling you in a couple of minutes. Is there anything you want to say before we start talking? Or, just like trying to make it feel a little more approachable. Cause there's that like hesitancy and shyness. That's like a big thing for when someone's reaching out for help.
Yeah, it's such a vulnerable experience to need help and to want help and, being afraid that you won't really be met when you try to get help.
Yeah.
There was something, I wanted to ask you, let's say someone who's listening is not a therapist or they are, and they feel like this would be something that they would like to help with. They would like to work on your peer collective site. What do they need to do?
So you can email me, tim@peercollective.com, or you can just go to Peer Collective and click on one of the contact us kinds of things and just, send a message. And, we'll kind of figure out, depending on like where you are. We're probably going to need to hire more licensed professionals. So the licensed professionals the role, we call it a counseling support role, like because people are kind of contractors. We're not like managing them, but we're like there to support around clinical issues. And so it's that type of relationship, and we do check-ins, and I don't know, like, I get calls from peer counselors on the platform, many calls a day, just sort of like, someone booked a session with me for an hour from now, and I've never, I've never had a panic attack. Like, I say that I have anxiety, I've had anxiety before, but I've never had a panic attack. What do I need to know about panic attacks to be able to support somebody? And so that's like a big role. That's like a big sort of like a role where we're going to be hiring more licensed people. And then, but if somebody just wants to have like some of our peer counselors are Google employees and like other people with like kind of full-time jobs, and they just but they love this type of work. And so they do it in their spare time. And so, you can find me through peercollective.com and just reach out.
Okay, so you hire both peer counselors and licensed professionals. So people who are listening who are not licensed professionals, but they are just really empathetic and like helping people, they could contact you as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is a great thing. And I think, like you said, there are the crisis text line and other crisis lines, which are for crisis.
Yeah.
And they're not just to listen when you're not in crisis. And then there's therapy, which is when you have a deeper issue that you really need to explore and work through. And I think you're right that this is a great gap filler, and also seems like it could do a lot to just making our world kinder and more compassionate, which is much needed.
I hope so.
Well, Tim, is there a place where everything you're doing is all in one place, or would you rather people look you up on Peer Collective? Yeah, I mean, if
you can find my sort of books and talks around on the internet. Sadly, I'm not good at kind of like keeping all that in one place for people. But you can if you just kind of Google my name, then you can find, books and talks and things like that.
Okay.
But for me, so much of what I'm doing right now is really focused on Peer Collective and trying to grow that.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to help you spread the word about that. And I hope that many people who need it will find it through listening to this.
Thanks.
So I just want to thank you again for being my guest today.
Yeah, it's great to connect again.
Hey therapists, do you feel stuck working with clients who can't access their emotions or name their inner experience? Do you find it difficult to work with people who are disconnected from their own emotions, and they may be disconnected within the therapeutic relationship as well? Learn a comprehensive approach to conceptualize your client's concerns. Sensory motor psychotherapy uniquely includes the body in therapy as both the source of information and target for intervention because words are not enough. We all know that talk therapy is limited. You've heard it discussed on this podcast multiple times. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you also know that I am a huge fan of sensory motor psychotherapy. I've completed levels 1 and 2 and plan to pursue the certification level 3. And the reason why I love it so much is because I've experienced shifts within myself through the experiential training process and huge shifts in my work with clients through the training that I've received with Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute. I highly recommend that you check out their website, sensorymotor.org, to learn about their trainings. In fact, they have trainings coming up this summer, and to view their webinars, learn more about what sensory motor psychotherapy is. It's a beautiful, powerful method that I can't recommend highly enough. So check them out at sensorymotor.org.
Thank you for listening to Therapy Chat with your host, Laura Reagan, LCSW-C. For more information, please visit therapychatpodcast.com.